I'm talking with Joseph Hebert. There's been a notable upsurge in adult conversions to the Catholic faith. Despite the fact that we have a long-term decline in religious affiliation, there's a lot to assess as to why this is happening, but also what we can do to reach out to those souls who need to come into the full embrace of the church. Joseph is professor of politics, law, and leadership at St. Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa, and author most recently of this article in Catholic World Report, Natural Law and Evangelization. Joseph, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
I want to ask you to talk about your thoughts pertaining to what's drawing people into the Catholic faith now. This, as we've mentioned, this record upsurge of converts every year.
Well, I think there's a lot of ways you could look at that, but one thing that comes to mind as I look over this is the statement from the Second Vatican Council: Christ, the final Adam, by the revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to himself and makes his supreme calling clear. So in other words, I think one way you can look at this is that it's in the church and through an encounter with Christ that we can actually find ourselves. And who wouldn't want to do that?
Now, let's talk about this from a natural law perspective. That's a great place to start in this conversation. Why highlight the reality of natural law?
Well, it at first occurred to me to write this piece just in the context of the kind of struggle that we're familiar with the church trying to teach its doctrines, particular doctrines of the church, especially in social issues. And I've heard the complaint over the years that, well, it's just hard to explain these things because so much of the logic of the church's teachings is based on natural law. And then the follow-up is that, well, people don't generally understand natural law today. It's not part of the culture. So I thought a couple things. First of all, it's necessary for the church to be able to teach natural law, right? It's a precious heritage of Western civilization, you could say, but it's also, as I explored in the article, I think it's intertwined with the nature of creation and redemption. This is, the natural law reflects the way God created us. Sin takes us away from that. That's the problem that had to be solved. But redemption in solving that problem is bringing us back to that nature and healing it and perfecting it and raising it up. So I think it's an integral part of the faith. It's something that both inside the church is important to understand so we can understand our own faith, but also in terms of evangelization, what is there for others in the church? It's really finding, the perfection of their own nature and in the path to true happiness.
A big part of that perfection is in the way of virtue. Tell us about virtue and the path to happiness.
Well, a virtue, there's a number of ways we could define virtue, but if it's, it's a good habit and it's a habit in accordance with reason. But what does it mean to be reasonable? This is one of the many ways that I think in the modern world, we often lose sight of the natural law logic, because reason can be reduced to just some kind of a calculation of how to get, how to fulfill desires or how to control things, make things happen. But it's important to see that reason ultimately is something that connects us to the nature of things, ultimately God himself. And that nature and creation and God, the creator, this is an order that is good and lovable. And that's what reason can ultimately do for us. It helps us to actually be able to see and understand the lovable, admirable, wonderful order of things. And then we want to act in accordance with that. We want to serve that. So that's at the heart of virtue. I'd say every virtue is dealing with different challenges that we might face. So, courage is dealing with if things are frightening or dangerous. Prudence is dealing with if things are complicated in a practical sense, and we have to think it through. But ultimately, they're all about the same thing, which is really coming into clarity about the nature and the order of things and acting accordingly.
Plato has a great analogy about this question of development of virtue. It's in the Republic, if I'm remembering correctly. Can you share with us that analogy and therefore why it's difficult? It takes effort to build virtue, and yet it's the only path to happiness.
Yes, absolutely. Plato has a lot of beautiful reflections on the nature of virtue and reason within the human soul, and how reason is situated in respect to the passions and then to the world around us. And in the Laws, he has an interesting twist on that, where he says that there's this sort of golden chain, and this chain is drawing us towards what is good and true and beautiful. But then we have these iron links that are just like dragging us in a different direction. And so if you imagine just by itself, we have, in a sense, by nature, we have the guidance that we need, but it's at great disadvantage, right? That golden chain can easily snap, and these iron links can draw us in the other direction. So from his viewpoint, he's looking at what is it that can support that part of us that is aware of and desires what is good. And here we could look at the liberal arts, for example. The liberal arts is really just a lot of different ways of trying to cultivate the best part of our humanity, and to increase our ability to know and do what's good. And then, of course, there is supernatural grace, which is the ultimate answer for that.
And that ultimate answer of supernatural grace builds upon our nature, and therefore we have an obligation to keep seeking the virtuous life, even if we don't know Jesus Christ.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's so interesting to look at, what Scripture tells us, for example, about, human nature and humanity. I looked at a couple different passages of St. Paul, for example, and on the one hand, he's showing how everybody, Jews and Gentiles, are scandalized by the gospel. There's things that are just go contrary to the wisdom of the world, that kind of pragmatism. But on the other hand, he talks about how the Gentiles who don't have the divine law, they still have consciences that bear witness to them of good and evil. And they're thinking about this, and they're disputing this, and they're not without any knowledge of that. So this is where we are, you could say, by nature, is that we're fallen. We're created good, but we're fallen. So we still have that original goodness, but we have this tremendous struggle within ourselves. The line through the human heart, between good and evil, and so we need help. Adam and Eve started with that relationship with God from the beginning. But because they turned from him, this has created a more complex picture. So we have to be able to return back to God if we want to have the healing and the help that's necessary for our nature to function properly.
We're running out of time in this segment, but I want to just touch on this. All of what you've shared sounds very obvious to all of us, and yet we've seen a move in society to rewrite how the human person operates, and you can trace that back to a few sources, but Machiavelli becomes one of them.
Yes, absolutely. Within my field, Machiavelli looms pretty large as somebody who I think was very deliberately, he didn't really invent any of these arguments or ideas, but I would say he kind of packaged them back in the 1500s. He packaged them in a way that was going to sell like a better world. We can make the world better if we change our mentality. And one thing he does is he gets rid of the concept of objective goodness. He says this is imaginary, the idea that something is good or evil, intrinsically. He really eradicates the whole concept of an order of things, moral or order in particular. And what he replaces that with is simply desire and the satisfaction of desires. So if you want something and you're able to get it, that's great. That's all you have to think about.
I'm talking with Joseph Hebert. He's the author most recently of Natural Law and Evangelization, published on Catholic World Report. And we're talking about basically those simple things that speak to human nature and why we need to reclaim them if we want to talk about evangelization. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Talking with Joseph Hebert, Professor of Politics, Law and Leadership at St. Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa. We're talking about natural law and the need for mastering that when we engage in evangelization. We've been talking thus far, Joseph. I want to ask you to speak to what the natural law is. How can people learn to engage with the natural law? Because it's not a subjective set of opinions in each person's mind, so to speak. There's an objectivity to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I like to remember about the natural law, St. Thomas Aquinas says that it's a participation in the eternal law. And by the eternal law, he means the wisdom with which God created and governs the universe. So just to give a sense of how crucial this is, God is giving us a share of his own, wisdom, and that's implanted in us by nature. That means that, the fundamental inclinations that we have by nature, which easily get distorted, but at their root, they're basically good. So if you look again at, St. Thomas, he goes through what are the things that we desire by nature. And he also has a nice general kind of encapsulation of that, which is that the good, the objective good, is what preserves and perfects the being of things. Because everything in Genesis, it says God created things and they were good. So the way things are created is good. Whatever preserves and perfects that is the essence of what is good. So for human beings, that would be, for example, obviously the preservation of human life, also the procreation and education of children, because the human species, has to continue. And finally, last but not least, what is unique about human nature among the animals is that we're rational animals. And as rational animals, we actually seek knowledge and friendship with God and with one another. And so those are the basic elements that he identifies as, being the precepts, as he calls it, of the natural law. And by the precept, it's a principle. It's kind of a beginning point of thinking about action, which starts with the end or purpose. If we're going to do good with our actions and our choices, these are the things that we should be promoting.
Now, when we understand that, we need to start then engaging the natural law and raising our children to do the same, just having real conversations about it. But you also highlight that mastering the natural law is going to be a crucial way for us to engage evangelizing today. How so?
Well, I think, one way you can look at it is, through the influence of Machiavelli and others, people are given, I would say, sort of false promises, right? They're given the idea that you can satisfy all your desires, you can grow in, control over things and be fulfilled. But the reality is that's not the template for a good life and a fulfilling life. So sooner or later, people come to realize that this isn't really going where they thought it was going and where they hoped it was going. So they want to know the answer to that. What am I missing? What's missing in this picture? And there's various ways that can come up for people in their lives. But, the answer again is in God as the creator and the redeemer. And especially in the first part of that, that's built into all of us. Our very nature itself has an imprint of God in it. So if we can find that and we can connect with that, and then we can see that fingerprint of God in our nature, that matches with what the gospel is teaching, right? Because it's the same God.
Funnily enough, a lot of our present critiques on society and therefore the waywardness of souls matches many minds in history of the past, including Thomas More in Utopia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting about, Thomas More, because he had, as a statesman, as a Catholic statesman, he had such an intense desire to do good in the world. And he saw all the corruption and the greed and the injustice and the power hungriness and things like that. And so early in his career, he's trying to figure out how to approach this and how to make things better. And he creates this fictional character, Raphael, who shares, I think, a lot of the same criticisms of the world and how disordered it is. But he gets carried away with the idea of that he needs to find a perfect solution where he can, guarantee his success. He can fix everything. And that leads into some absurdities and paradoxes that Moore brings out in the book. I gave an example in the article that he thinks the death penalty is radically unjust, and there is this constant use of the death penalty for things like theft in England at the time. And in any case, in order to abolish the death penalty, he's coming up with this society where ultimately nobody would have any freedom. Everybody would be controlled by the government. And then if anybody gets out of line, they'll be put to death. So he ends up robbing everybody of their human dignity and also still using the death penalty. So I think Moore is trying to give us a warning there. The flip side of that is that, our job is, within the natural law is to seek our own conversion and our own, living up to the principles of what is right, and then to help to draw others into that. And there's a tremendous power in that, but it's not the same kind of fantastical power that Raphael wants to have. In other words, there's some kind of limits. We have to be humble enough to see that our task is to do the best we can within the place that God places us.
In other words, if we don't ourselves embrace natural, and frankly, if we are baptized theological virtue, then we easily cede morality to force, to people who can wield force, typically the state, but also totalitarian dictators and the like. Share with us a little about that and how we're seeing that today.
Well, one of the things that Moore liked to quote quite a bit is, this fable of Aesop of how, we like to take our own faults and put them behind our back, and then take the faults of others and put them in front of us. And so I think that's one of the key things here is if we're always orientated towards looking at other people's faults and trying to correct them, then we get more of the sense that with power, we're going to be able to fix everything, and not realizing that we ourselves could, we're always susceptible to going astray. We need self-discipline. We need, vigilance over our own soul. And we need the grace of God to be able to stay on track. So today, I think the simplest way to put, the nature of this problem today would be political ideologies. Any kind of thing that's not rooted in the actual order of things and is more based on, you could say, fantasy of what we think we can transform the world. The world, the nature of things is not good enough for us, and we're going to remake it. And there's many different versions of that. And as we know, combined with technology and things like this, some of these ideologies have done tremendous, damage to the world, always with some kind of a pretense that they're going to fix everything.
Which brings us back to the original question, that knowing how to dialogue the natural law will actually help us reach souls who don't know the gospel.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's what people are born for, or made for. And I think the culture, there's bits and pieces of this left in the culture, even though it's been, left behind for the most part. But there's so many, like you mentioned earlier, that a lot of this is very commonsensical. So there's still, a lot of ways that people may have encountered these things, but putting it together and piecing it together and seeing what is, the actual meaning and purpose of human life, it's missing in the culture, and people miss that. So the more that we can understand how that works, then we can bring that, not only for ourselves, but for those around us who haven't yet found the faith, and help them to see how it fits together.
Well, Joseph, a real delight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
My guest has been Joseph Hebert, Professor of Politics, Law, and Leadership at St. Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa. And we've been talking about how natural law conversations can help be a bridge to evangelization. I'm Marcus Peter.